Henry John Temple, Lord Palmerston, one of my great heroes, famously said, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." On foreign policy, it's crucial to remember that we don't have any people around the world who are always our friends and who are always on our side. Over 1,000 years of history, sometimes we've been at war with France, sometimes we've been sympathetic to France, sometimes we've been at war with Germany, and sometimes, as in victory against Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo, the Germans have been on our side. In these great spans of history, we have had alliances and enemies, but our interests should always, invariably and unfailingly be those of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Over the weekend, President Trump, the President of the United States, triggered the largest crisis in UK-US relations since Suez in 1956, as he announced his intention to impose a 10% tariff on all goods imported to the United States from Britain and 7 other European countries, unless they let him take control of Greenland. The levies would rise to 25% on the 1st of June if an agreement were not reached. The Prime Minister responded in an emergency press conference this morning.
Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance.
I fear Keir Starmer is actually wrong that alliances depend upon self-interest, and pressure certainly determines who we choose as an ally. Donald Trump's attitude towards Greenland is one that's hostile to the interests of His Majesty's government and indeed of His Majesty's subjects. It's not something that we can simply roll over and say, go in and take it. I believe in nation states. I'm a Westphalian. But that means nation states have borders, and borders need to have a degree of integrity and security. And other nation states have a strong interest in defending them, even when they're small. The one thing you cannot do is invade another country or take its territory, because it then becomes open season. And that applies just as much to America as it does to Russia in Ukraine, or China in relation to Taiwan, or Iraq when it invaded Kuwait. So what can we do? Well, we have to recognize one really crucial fact, and that is that the special relationship is essentially a fiction. It's a fiction that plays to the amour-propre of the United Kingdom, but it's pretty meaningless. America operates in America's interests. Now, fortunately, our interests and those of the United States often coincide, as they did in the second half of the Second World War and throughout the Cold War. And when that happens, it makes sense sometimes to do things that you wouldn't otherwise choose to do because they're of benefit to your ally in the bigger picture. That's perfectly rational. But there will come points when we must realize that there are other countries in the world with whom we can do business and with whom we should have special relationships. We should look at strengthening our alliance with India. It will be, is proving in this century to be a great and powerful country, and that will continue. It's becoming increasingly important. We should also look at our alliance with Japan. Even the powerful United States cannot afford to alienate all its allies at once. If we have deep alliances with countries across the globe, we protect our interests, and we may encourage the United States to be a little less aggressive. America may want Greenland. It may want money and resources from Greenland along with rare earth metals. But taking it from Denmark is against our national interest, and we have to be, as Palmerston said, devoted to our national interest. Now, many viewers will know I quite admire Donald Trump because he's single-minded about leading his own country and getting things done. And he's shown refreshingly that politicians can change things and break through the blob, the deep state, as Americans call it. And British leaders, British politicians can and should learn from that. But we must remember that his slogan is "Make America Great Again." It's not about us, it's about him. So we must not forget that for us, it is Britain first, not America. As always, let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com.
This interruption is brought to you by ExpressVPN and their New Year deal. New Year, new VPN, and a huge saving of up to 80% if you act now. You're busy planning how to get in shape, but the hackers are planning how to get into your accounts. ExpressVPN locks down your connection so you can start the year protecting your data. So scan the QR code or click the link in the description now.
But I'm now delighted to be joined by Daniel in the Lion's Den, I think, this evening. He's normally agree on everything. The chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson, and, of course, my panel. Greg, thank you for coming in. I mean, this is a really hostile act by your president, and he has to recognise that if he wants a special relationship with the UK, he can't behave like this.
Yeah, I think it's a speed bump. And this is classic President Trump, though. You know, he goes out with something really provocative, throws a grenade in the room, and then a week later, or sometimes a day later, but a week or a month later, everything settles down. I don't think these tariffs will ever take effect. I think they'll do a deal. It won't be an annexation of Greenland. It won't be a purchase of Greenland. First of all, Jacob, we don't have the money. Okay, $750 billion on top of a $39 trillion debt is just too much money. So I think it's just going to be, you know, some sort of cooperation.
But this matters. It really sours relations. And America depends on soft power as well as hard power. And the soft power requires countries like the UK to think that America's broadly on our side. Actually, it's quite clear that America's not on America's side. Now, I don't think this is unreasonable, but I think it helps us to be clear-eyed about it.
Sure, I was kind of pleased to see the Prime Minister today say that I, act in the best interest of my country. That was good. I wish he'd say the same thing about the Chagos Islands. Yeah. But maybe the Chagos Islands would have been a good moment to express that. But I do think that there's going to be speed bumps, and I think this is a speed bump. I think the president, yes, he's provocative. I would prefer he's provocative with our adversaries and not our allies. But this is the way he operates, and I bet in 2 weeks there'll be some sort of arrangement with Greenland that's mutually beneficial for all.
OK, but he seems to be quite nice to Putin and quite tough to his allies. This doesn't seem to me to be very clever foreign policy.
I wouldn't say that's consistent, though, Jacob. I mean, if you think about it, three presidents prior to President Trump knew that Putin had killed his own people in 1999. The CIA has known it since 99, and he was the first one to call him out on it. He sent Javelin missiles. He put the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, he sanctioned that. So, he's done all these things that were quite aggressive against Putin. And as he says quite often, this war never would have started if he was in office. So, I think there's moments where he wants diplomacy. He's a peace president. He's very much an anti-war president. He would rather reach out. There's times where it wasn't productive to be very, very hostile to Putin, and there's times where it is. And I think he's learned the hard way that Putin's the loose cannon here.
How is this playing in Piora? I know you're mainly in the United States nowadays. Is the American electorate thinking, oh, good, Donald Trump is a great world leader? Or are they thinking, why on earth doesn't he get on with dealing with the unemployment rate in the United States and the cost of living crisis?
I think it's the latter, Jacob. I think the high point for foreign policy was probably the Israel-Gaza Hamas peace agreement, right? So that was a great moment for diplomacy and for using military force when it's tactical and it's targeted, which he did quite well. But I think, generally speaking, the American electorate doesn't care about foreign policy. They care about their pocketbooks. And I think the president will do much better if he gets these foreign policy issues settled and then focuses on the economy for Americans. Because
obviously there are elections later this year, the important midterm elections. The House of Representatives is only held by a very thin margin. Yeah. Is he at risk of concentrating on foreign policy and then becoming lame duck president because he doesn't have the majority through the system?
Absolutely, it's a risk. I don't think it will happen. I think he's smart enough to turn it around. After the off-year elections in November, he did pivot, and you heard nothing but affordability and the economy for a few months. But sometimes the real world interrupts, and something happens in the world that he has to deal with, and he is the president of the great superpower.
But this is an unnecessary one. I mean, Greenland.
You can argue it's an own goal. Yeah, it's a self-inflicted wound. But I do think that he gets frustrated, and he's frustrated that his partners, his allies, like Keir Starmer, weren't sitting in a room and saying, "How can we help you get a deal done with Greenland?" You know, it doesn't have to be annexation or a purchase. It doesn't have to be the next Louisiana purchase, which was 40% of our country. But I think that ship has sailed.
And you know you will lend the money to do that by a British bank,
yes.
Even though it went straight on to France. Anyway, that's another nice historical aside. John and Stephen, let me bring you both in. John, you and I are both strong supporters of the United States, admire it as a country, but actually our interests don't always coincide, and ultimately, as British politicians, our interest must be the UK.
Well, of course, and I agree with your statement, but I do think here the United Kingdom should not get aggressive in the way that the EU is, but should try and prove that its special access to the President, which this Prime Minister has been courting, can be used to good purpose, because I think there is a deal to be done here. I think it's a great pity that President Trump started by threatening everybody, because the people that really matter are the Greenlanders. There aren't many of them, and they might well want to shake off their colonial past, because the polls say that they're not very keen to stay as a colony of Denmark. It's very out of date, and Denmark can't offer a lot. But they're not going to want to welcome the United States of America in this kind of mood. I think there's a deal to be done on minerals, on money, and on American defence support for Greenland, which has always been there. After all, the American army occupied Greenland during the Second World War to keep the Germans out, which I think the Greenlanders were pleased about. So there's a deal to be done, and the UK should be on the side of doing a really good deal.
Stephen, do you think this is an occasion where Keir Starmer can show the value of his foreign policy and his value of trying to be as close to Trump as possible? Because at the moment, we currently seem to be bunged in with everybody else.
Well, I think he's treading a very, very narrow path here, a very, very dangerous tightrope, because he doesn't want to completely lose what support remains in this country, but equally he realises the economic imperatives. A couple of things on your point earlier on in your monologue. Portugal has always been our allies, so we do have
1986, the Treaty of Windsor, yes.
But equally, I have to say, we went to war with Germany in 1939 over Poland. It wasn't in this country's interest, but it was the right, decent thing to do because we had a treaty with Poland. However, the key thing for me that's really horrific about this, and I think it's quite interesting, you mentioned about the German, when the Germans occupied Denmark, and the Americans included. Dashiell Hammett was one of the soldiers. He actually wrote the Maltese Falcon in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. But look, if you actually talk to anybody in the Navy, they'll tell you that the Greenland, Iceland, UK corridor is the most heavily patrolled area anywhere in the North Atlantic, because that's where the Russian submarines come down. Yeah. If I was in Iceland, I'd be looking with some trepidation to see where he's going to go. But finally, I read The Art of the Deal, Trump's book, before Trump, this way, The Dart of the Eel. But I mean, and one of the things he says in this book, he said exactly the point that Greg Spencer so beautifully put. He throws a hand grenade, sees what settles after us, he aims high, he settles for the medium. Well, that's his way.
Ask for 100 and take 50.
A very interesting clip that I'd like to show with Speaker Johnson saying we should take President Trump seriously but not literally. Right. And I wonder if we see that, and then I can ask you for your thoughts on it.
Sure.
The president has a certain manner in which he goes about doing things, and sometimes it's for the effect, the public effect, the shock and awe that is a means to an end.
This is the take him seriously but not literally stuff.
You've heard that phrase, and that's right. We take him seriously, not always literally, and I think he's okay with that. Whereas in America, the far left media, they take him always literally and not seriously.
Do you think it's a bit dangerous to be serious but not literal?
Yeah, well, the speaker makes a good point. And I saw that clip earlier, and I was trying to replicate some of it because I think he's really good at this, Speaker Johnson. And so, look, I think there are moments where it feels dangerous. But that happens in a relationship. You know, we invaded Grenada in '83, and I don't think Mrs. Thatcher was particularly. Mrs. Thatcher was not happy with President Reagan, and I don't think we were really behind the Falkland Islands when Mrs. Thatcher took care of that. And although personally I was all for it, but I think the government was a bit frustrated. So you have those moments. The ultimate, you mentioned Suez, of course, but it was only 5 years ago when Joe Biden recklessly pulled out of Afghanistan and wouldn't pick up the phone when the Prime Minister was calling him, when Boris Johnson was calling him. So that was a real speed bump, too. I think we'll get over this.
Well, it's not as bad as 1812, and your White House wouldn't be white if it hadn't been for us burning it down and eating Van Bjorn's dinner.
We're still a little bitter about that, yeah.